but we're here to give a quick, thorough overview of landscape architecture and urban planning. And the first thing that I always get is a lot of people always ask me, what do you actually do? So the technical definition is, achieving balance between built and natural environments. That's probably the most high-level description I can formulate for the profession. Traditionally, most people think of parks. This park here is New York Central Park, and I would say it's the perennial when you talk about the profession of landscape architecture, because it was created by Frederick Law Olmsted, who coined the term. So before that, it was basically just high-end landscape design. He's the one that actually coined that landscape architecture title. The other thing we work on consistently and a lot of is streetscape and public spaces. So if anybody's been downtown, this is the old public square, and that's the new public square. It's got the fountain in the bottom, green space on the top, the existing monument in the corner in the cafe zone, done by a landscape architect out of New England. Urban planning is a bit of a subset of landscape architecture. Here is a good example of a plaza at Cleveland State. It's called Rhodes Tower. Right now, I think it's being somewhat renovated, but this was done back in the early 2000s. Another good example, top left, is a unique plaza in the Carolinas that has this cool fog feature. It's something that's nice and different from putting in a water feature within a public space. The lower right, this is Perk Plaza in downtown Cleveland, newly renovated within the last 10 years. It's a very common space around lunchtime because they have what's called Walnut Wednesdays, which is where a bunch of food trucks literally line each side of the street. The other thing we do a lot of is play areas. So play areas can include swings, they can include slides, equipment, fitness equipment, I think is a popular one that we do, and a few different types of fitness equipment. So just some fun gifts I like to find for all this stuff. Continuation on play areas, talk about play surfacing, how important it is in case you fall. Obstacles in the way. Dog parks, I have designed a few dog parks in my day. They are a lot of fun. Same with other types of play areas. Athletics. One of my specialties or passions is athletic projects. So track and fields, baseball fields, softball fields, pretty much the whole gamut. Just like to make sure that everybody knows of all these things out here and some of the fun stuff with them. I think that's it for my silly gifts. Oh, no, not done yet. Bicycle facilities. I am an avid cyclist, so I do care a lot about bike lanes and how they're designed. We also do a lot of trail designs, streets with bikes, and then kind of some issues that you will have with bike lanes and shared lanes, which is the issue with this one here. It's not on an actual bike lane. Urban design. So if anybody's been to Flats East Bank, this is the rendering for the new Flats East Bank Plaza and surrounding area. That is basically what it turned out to be. One of the more perennial projects in the downtown area over the last 10 years by far. And there is like strong continuation of the river development due to this as a catalyst project. Interior landscapes. This isn't a rendering, it's an actual place. This is an airport in Shanghai, and it's probably one of my most favorite interior spaces. I've never been there, but the fact that they can get away with doing stuff like this is incredible. Corporate grounds is another one. This is a unique space overseas again. I want to say Australia or New Zealand, and they did a great job of integrating the architecture within the existing landscape. So it's a good collaboration between disciplines. Water resources, which was hit on last week. Top left is kind of a more traditional water resource basin. And then from the landscape architect side of things, we try to think about it in a different way to where it's a little bit more usable, becomes a plaza space, performance space, rather than just a hole in the ground to collect rainwater. Probably, at least in the United States, the most famous memorial to date, which is the 9/11 Memorial. So it's the fountains and the size of the Twin Towers, done by a landscape architect. Very interesting backstory that I'm not going to get into on this one of how this project came to be. It was a design competition, and the original idea came from a grad student that they actually encouraged to work with professional designers in order to make this thing happen. Trails, all-purpose trails, as well as multi-use trails. So there's a combination of walker, hikers, and then a cycle track, all kind of happening in this zone. So that's kind of the overall gamut of what I believe landscape architecture entails. Now, one of the things that we didn't hit on last week that is important to talk about this week is reimagining social and gathering conditions based on COVID. So there's many things that have happened in the past year, and there is a shift in basic social philosophy. So now we're not shaking hands anymore, we're bumping elbows. We have to, we're trying to stay and remain socially distant from everybody, inside as well as outside. And the question is, what do we do with that? How do we start to imagine our spaces to take these things into consideration so we can still live a long, healthy life? This is a nice park in New York where they actually created these circles so people could still gather, but they could still remain socially distanced per COVID requirements. More of that is we're starting to see these dining bubbles, and this application can go beyond just an eatery, but that is kind of a new growing trend with how do we make our patio spaces even more safe for diners. Another one, this is a design competition with, how can we create some type of usable space in a park that still maintains social distancing requirements. It's pretty cool. I was pretty impressed with how this thing came out. Another series of ideas is, what do we do with outdoor classrooms? So this school basically turned a big paved area / parking lot into a giant outdoor classroom with very simple materials, hay bales, logs, etc. And with proper spacing, they're able to still do their tasks while maintaining safe distances. Same thing that's happening down here. Here's another good example of how we can do all that. And then some built items that will allow us to either act as a teaching area, a gathering space, or small areas for more of an intimate setting. Lastly, there is a big discussion about the public realm with post-COVID in mind. And what I mean by that is the space between buildings within a streetscape. So because of COVID, we are simply not traveling as much. So there is no longer an extreme need for vehicles. And now we're seeing communities do something like this, where they're actually putting barriers into the roadway and in essence making the sidewalk zone bigger because people are wanting to be outside now that they don't have to drive everywhere. So it's allowing people more time to do what's called alternative transportation, which is walking, biking, rollerblading, scooters, skateboards, etc. And now we as designers have to rethink this entire condition. Before it was always, this road needs this much space because it's going to have this much cars. Now we're learning that that space can really change because we have 25 to 50% less vehicles on the roadway. So it is in a huge paradigm shift for urban designers as well as planners. Here's another good example where they basically just closed off several city blocks because they could. They didn't need it. People weren't traveling. So now you have all this room for people walking their dogs, people going for a jog, etc. Same with, how does that cafe zone start to expand beyond just the building facade? If you are close to the Ohio City area, you see where this is happening, where the city actually put in big concrete barriers in the roadway to get rid of the parking areas and allow those restaurants to have a bigger patio zone. Within the city of Cleveland, there's actually talks right now to make that a permanent condition. So typically, as a building or a restaurant, you couldn't go into the right of way. Now that whole idea is changing. So it's a big evolution. So really, we can start to think about our space not as here's the sidewalk, that's where our limits of space are. Spaces are starting to creep beyond that because of this shift. This is a very good set of graphics that I felt were interesting with, all right, how do we reimagine streets with less vehicles? I think they're to the extreme where, maybe certain streets simply go away and become these, linear park-like settings. Or maybe intersections really change to where, I know in Europe, they'll actually close intersections during the weekend and it becomes a pedestrian space in lieu of a vehicular space. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if they're like trying to figure out ways where like it could be like more naturey, why don't they have like the buildings incorporate with this environment? Like for instance, I feel like the cases the campus incorporates perfectly with the environment because like it's not like building street scenery. It flows. Like I think the building should land itself into the environment and not trying to make the environment work with the buildings.
So excellent point. And what you're referring to is, for Case's standpoint, that's like a campus setting where when they are laying out buildings, they are trying to incorporate the space around the buildings with all the surrounding buildings. What I'm referring to is we have an existing condition of buildings and roadways. They're already there. We don't have a lot of true green conditions where we can work with the existing landscape. So right now, with this image, this is a busy downtown area that because of COVID, we have less cars. So this artist is reimagining that streetscape as now that can become something green. And there's numerous studies that, well, a good example is because we're driving less, air pollution has significantly reduced. I think the best example is in India, where they can actually see the Himalayas behind them in the main town areas, where before there was so much air pollution that you couldn't even see the mountains. So that's what my reference is about buildings and landscapes within the street. Does that make sense?
I guess.
Can I add something too,
Sure.
Joey?
Yeah.
Places like Case or other types of universities, they have ownership of a lot more space, and so they can, and it's all clumped together, so they can choose to say, oh, I'm not going to develop this area next to a building, and so they can really integrate it with the landscape. But then when, the image that we're seeing in front of us, you literally have a different owner of a building from building to building to building and across the street. And so when we're having these discussions, all we can really talk about is the space that's already left behind and how to reimagine that. But ideally, when you do have a campus where you have ownership of a lot more space, you do try and do a master plan and kind of think long term, because buildings are not going to come up and down, are not going to be built and rebuilt, every few years. So it's a long-term plan. But it is easier when you have ownership of a lot more space connected to each other.
Right. And I think just from a public health standpoint, there's many studies that have learned that the elements of nature increases public health. There is health applications for doing that. So there are significant efforts to, within urban areas, increase green space, add landscaping as much as possible. You know, it's also called the urban heat island effect, trying to reduce that down. So all of those get intertwined with the urban area. So yes, the conversation I'm having here is about that urban area where we're dealing with all these existing built elements, and now we're trying to make them better for the people that live there, basically.